Hello everyone, it's Sylvia from Mythic Tarot. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to have a look at the top 10 most popular tarot decks ranked from number 10 to number 1. So just a couple of words to explain how I crunched the numbers. I looked at both TikTok and Instagram, and I have to say that after comparing the numbers, there is just not enough posts on TikTok in order to be able to compare the two platforms. So I decided, after checking a few decks in both platforms, to just stick to Instagram. And out of all the posts on Instagram, a whopping 25.8 million posts are about tarot. Out of these ones, we have 7.4 million dedicated to tarot cards, 6.8 million tarot reading, 4 million tarot reader, 3.1 million tarot community, 2.8 million tarot online, and 1.2 million tarot decks. So obviously I had to make a choice because, as you can imagine, there's a lot of things that can go wrong when you use a hashtag on Instagram. And you'll probably know, if you have an account on Instagram, you will probably realize that whenever you want to tag your deck in order for the whole of the tarot community to see your post, sometimes you just tap the first 3 or 4 letters and then a list of possible hashtags will appear, and then you choose the one you want. But if you're like me, you probably misspelled the names of the decks a couple of times. So I actually went through a few of the combinations that could have possibly been misspelled. But after doing a thorough research, I actually decided to stick to the names that were actually spelled correctly. And in many, many cases, you will notice that some decks were actually tagged with the in front of the name of the tarot, and some decks were not. So that's also something that we need to take into consideration. However, after a while, I just decided that I really had to draw a line, otherwise we would have had to take hours and possibly days of research. So this is to be taken with a grain of salt. It's something that is, let's say, updated as of today, which is the 11th of May, Sydney time. And so let's have a look at the top 10. We will rank them starting from number 10. And at number 10, we have the Waite Tarot. This deck has been spelled with the or without, so I had to look at both these possibilities. But we can say that combined, this one came up at 5,000 posts on Instagram, and it's definitely sitting at number 10. So the Waite Tarot is one of the oldest ones, and obviously in this case we can imagine that there'll be a few decks that were tagged with the same tag, so Waite Tarot, but they're not necessarily referring to this deck. This one that I've chosen is the one that has been printed by US Games, and it's also the peculiar one because it does have these kind of backs. If you're familiar with your Waite, you will know that there's almost an infinite number of variations of this deck. But it is not surprising that this is one of the most popular, or the top 10 most popular decks online or on Instagram, because it is, let's say, the original tarot. It's no surprise, of course, it's probably one of the decks that more or less all of the tarot readers would have at least owned in their collection. It is probably also one of the most used ones by tarot readers around the world. It is very clear, it's full of symbols, we know about this deck. I also appreciate that this one is reproducing the colors as faithfully as possible to the original version. There is also a version that is called the original 1908 tarot deck. However, I don't have that deck, so this is the one that I'm going to show you today. Apparently, that version has been color corrected even further. It's a straight reader. It's a fantastic deck. I like to use it, but these days we have been spoiled with so many different choices that, to be honest with you, this is not my go-to deck anymore. But this is number 10. And number 9, with over 6,000 posts, we've got the Mythic Tarot. My edition is this one with the blue backs. I do not, unfortunately, have the box of this deck anymore. I do have the guidebook, however. I also have the original black cloth, which I'm very proud of. I do think that it's a lot better than the new edition that has been published recently. I know that this deck was fetching a lot of money on, for example, Instagram posts or Facebook groups a few years ago. I actually got it from a lady that let me have it for a very reasonable price. And I have to say, it is a very beautiful deck. And it was one of the first examples in which the creators didn't want to go down the RWS clone path. It is a beautiful deck. I really love the color palette. Because it is called the Mythic Tarot, obviously it is thematic and it refers to mythology, as you can imagine from the title. I have to say, back then, they were not particularly concerned about cardstock because in this case, this deck feels like it's very flimsy, very thin. And it kind of worries me because I don't want to use it, I don't want to ruin it. And so it's not one of my go-to decks. Even though I have seen a lot of people trimming it down to just the artwork and it looks absolutely stunning. So this is the Mythic Tarot and it's definitely a number 9. And number 8, with 12,100 posts on Instagram, we have the Moonchild Tarot by Danielle Noel. I don't have this deck, so that's why you're currently looking at an image of it. This is a really beautiful deck. It's relatively recent, but to have that number of posts on Instagram, it means that it's actually really, really popular. It's a really beautiful deck. I did have it in my collection a few years ago, but I actually decided to rehome it because I also have another deck by the same creator, and we will look at it later, which is just resonating a little bit more for me. At number 7, that's another incredibly popular deck, and it's with 15,900 posts on Instagram, and I'm talking about the Morganger Tarot. Now, this deck is also not in my collection, and the simple reason is that I cannot decide between the full size of the deck, which has been published by US Games, and the teen version of the deck. I think that lately I have been really into mini decks or tarot in a teen decks, and I'll probably reach for the smaller size. Now that's a really beautiful deck because it looks like it's got that kind of 70s vibes to the, not just the color palette, for example, but also the images, and it's a number 7. And number 6, with 18,500 posts on Instagram, we have the Voyager Tarot. Now, I do have the Voyager Tarot. This is an older edition of the deck. The copyright on this deck is from 1984. And it's one of the revolutionary decks because back when it was released in 1984, I don't believe this is the version from 1984. It could possibly be. I have had this deck for a long, long time in my collection, but I don't have the box anymore, although I do still have the guidebook. This is a deck that has been breaking up with conventions more than other decks or the other decks that we've seen so far, so more than the Mythic Tarot or the Morganger, for example. And the reason is that it was actually one of the first experiment on art related to tarot with collage. This is a photographic collage, as you can see. Is an incredibly stunning deck. I have to say this is still one of my favorite decks in my entire collection. I do use it a lot. What happens was that this is the original deck that I had from many, many years ago. And so I tend not to use this version. I have a more recent version with a different cardstock and a slightly smaller size, which make it kind of easier to shuffle and use overall. I remember that at the beginning this deck was almost hailed as a new dawn for tarot. Using collage and photographic collage in this case was not something that anyone would have thought of doing back then. It was an experiment, it was very well received. And the fact that it was called the Voyager Tarot, I think it also helped people understand back then that we could look at tarot as something that could actually evolve with time. Until then, even the slight differences that we had in different decks, and I'm talking about decks that were not following the traditional imagery from the Thoth, for example, or the RWS, It is completely unique. It's beautiful. And I have to say, because back then, obviously, we were talking about manual collages, so we didn't have the possibility to work on a computer to collage these images. We're looking at a very well-made deck. I personally think it's really stunning, and it's one of my favorite ones in my collection. And this is at number 6, the Voyager Tarot. And number 5, with a remarkable 18,600 posts, we have another Danielle Noel Tarot, and it's the Star Child Tarot. Now, this deck is my favorite out of the two, the Moonlight and the Star Child, but this is a special edition of the Star Child Tarot. As you can see, this is the Akashic version. This one is my favorite out of the two, not just because I feel like I vibe a lot more with the energies of this deck compared to the Moonchild, but it's also because it's a standard tarot size. And this definitely makes it easier to use for me. As you can see, this deck is really loved by the tarot community, and justly so, because it's actually a really beautiful deck. This is also a photographic collage, but it does have this kind of cosmic vibes, ethereal vibes to it. And I have to say, there's a lot of people using this deck in a number of different manners. This deck has been used in a number of different ways for divination, meditation, journaling, and in any other way that you like to use this deck in your personal practice. It is very conducive of a very strong type of connection with these ethereal vibes. To me, if I had to choose an element, an alchemical element to refer this deck to, it would definitely be air. I know, however, that, for example, when I talk to other tarot readers or tarot collectors in the community, they like to refer to the Moonchild a lot more than this one. But I was very surprised to see that, as we've seen before, so when the Moonchild was fetching 12,100 posts on Instagram, the Star Child actually is at 18,600. As a disclaimer, though, I have to say that sometimes you will see that there's a lot of posts on Instagram referring to a deck that is not necessarily the one they have in the tags. I don't really know why the person posting these tags will use different tags other than the deck that they're using. Sometimes they probably want to put a tag that has got more hits, maybe to make it so that their post is well seen. I'm not entirely aware of that. What I know is that in my case, I always choose the correct tag for the deck that I'm using. Especially because, I don't know if you're the same, but sometimes I see a really beautiful deck on a post on Instagram and I really want it, or at least I want to check it out. And so I will just go in the description of the post and I will look for the name of the deck. And sometimes the post creator doesn't put the name, but they put the tag of the deck. So that's an indication of, at least it gives me a clue of what I should search for. So I always appreciate it when the tags are actually corresponding to the deck, because sometimes it can be confusing. In any case, this is the Star Child Tarot with 18,600 posts, and it's a number 5. And number 4 is another surprise with 20,400 posts on Instagram. We have The Good Tarot by Colette Baron Reid. I have had this deck for a number of years. What happened was that it's a publication by Hay House, and it was a really large size deck. It was an oracle size tarot deck. And I also didn't vibe, let's say, with the cardstock. It was very glossy, but the cards somehow managed to stick one to the other, and so it wasn't very practical for me to use. And so I decided one day to trim it to a standard tarot size. But what happened with that was that I was missing out on a lot of the artwork, and so I really didn't like the result, and I decided to rehome the deck. I don't exclude repurchasing that deck in the future because it is an elemental deck. So if you're not familiar with this deck, all of the minor suits have been renamed to the corresponding alchemical element of the suit, and I really appreciate that. So now we're approaching the top 3 most popular tarot decks in Instagram. So at number 3, with a whopping 25,600 posts, we've got the Devian Moon Tarot by Patrick Valenza. This has been published by US Games. It is a mass market deck. However, Patrick Valenza is a very prolific author, and you will know that there's a number of decks, indie decks as well, that can be purchased from his website. This is the borderless edition, and I also have the coffee table book, which goes with this deck. It's an absolutely stunning book, and I highly recommend it. It is a slightly pricey book, so it's not a guidebook to the tarot. When you purchase this edition from US Games, you will also receive a little white book. So if you want to, you can actually use this deck with the little white book that it is provided. But if you really love this deck, in particular, if you, like me, really appreciate this very special art style, you will probably love the coffee table book. This is an incredible deck. Most of us in the tarot community will use this deck for shadow work because it's a very intense and powerful deck. Many of these images are probably also triggering. So there's a lot of people who really have a strong opinion against this deck. I can say that I understand why. When we see tarot cards like the Hermit in this case, we can see why this could be triggering for many of us. And as always, I'm always on the side of compassion. Be compassionate to yourself. If you don't feel like you can use this deck for whatever reason, you don't have to use it. However, I have to say that this deck can actually help work on many, many issues that we can have. It is definitely not one of those decks that you use on a regular basis, on a daily basis. And to be honest with you, unless I'm actually specifically requested to use this deck by someone I'm reading for, I don't reach for this deck when I'm reading for clients. This is, however, a well-used deck, as you can see. All of the cards are more or less chipped on the edges. And the reason why it is so well used by me is because I really, really enjoy it. I have to say I don't reach for it as much as I used to, but this is something that is completely safe in my collection. I will never rehome this deck because I really enjoy it. So this is the Devian Moon Tarot, and with 25,600 posts on Instagram, it is definitely a number 3. And now we're going to have a look at number 2 with an incredible 60,200 posts on Instagram. And it's actually more than that because it's one of those cases in which some people posted with the at the beginning of the deck, some don't. The highest number of posts was without the article. So we have the Light Seers Tarot by Chris-Anne Donnelly. This is the pocket edition, and I also have the full-size edition. However, I do prefer this one ever since I got it. This is published by Hay House. Also, the full edition is published by Hay House. And if you don't have the tin edition and you were wondering whether there was a guidebook with it or not, I can show you. This is a full guidebook, so you will have exactly the same amount of words and description of the cards that you find in a full version. This deck, let me just zoom in because it is a tiny deck. The reason why I really love this deck is because it's a very modern take on the RWS. However, I have to say that it's a very straight reader. There is a market, I have to say, for the indie version of this deck. In particular, I've seen it fetching up to 500 Australian dollars when it shows the original Ten of Swords card. Now, as much as I've been looking for it, I couldn't find it for a decent price. So I would really love to have a copy of the indie deck, but I'm not willing to spend that much money on it, especially because I believe that the version that has been published by Hay House, even the full-size version, is actually really, really good. There is I think it's a Czech version of this deck that has indigo colored edges. It is a mass market version, but I'm not entirely sure that it's still available. However, if you do have it, you will see, if you're lucky enough to have the indie edition as well, you will see that it's not much different, even when it comes to the size, which is slightly larger than the full size of the Hay House version. And the color of the edges varies between teal and indigo, so it's not that much of a difference. This is a really beautiful deck, as I was saying. It's a very easy reader. I would definitely recommend it for beginners. If you don't want to start with an RWS or an RWS clone, this one is definitely RWS based. But as I said, it does show a modern take on it. Chris-Anne is a very popular and prolific tarot creator. Other decks by Chris-Anne Donnelly are, for example, the Tarot of the Curious Creatures and the Divine Muse Tarot. But are you ready for number one? So at number one, with an incredible 65,300 posts, we've got the Osiris Zen Tarot. Now, this deck is, well, this one in specific is very old, as you can see, with how well used it looks. I have two versions of this deck. I also have the smaller version. I believe that one is very recent. And I have to say, the reason why it's been used so much is because this deck actually represents, let me just zoom in a little bit. This deck represents a turning point in my years of reading tarot. And the reason is that originally I bought it, well, a couple of decades ago, and I struggled to read with it at first. I don't know whether your experience has been similar to mine, but I have been talking about this deck with other tarot readers or tarot collectors, and we all share the sense of surprise at not just the images chosen, because this is, it does, let's say, it is inspired by the RWS when it comes to the interpretation of the cards, but when it comes to the images, it really chose a different path. So this is based by the philosophy and the teaching of Osho, but it has been illustrated by Madhava Padma, who is also the illustrator of a number of other decks. Most recently, we have seen, for example, the Sacred Chi Tarot, which is a deck that I'm going to study in a deep dive with my Sunlight and Starlight members. And she's also the creator or illustrators of a I Ching deck. These images are so intuitive and at the same time very talkative, very communicative. There is an entire process of reading with this deck, but it is a learning curve. Let's put it this way. I did struggle at the beginning, but the reason why I struggled was because there has been a very extensive renaming of the cards. And even when you look at, for example, this card, so you see the number here. If you're not familiar with this deck, I'm just going to explain how it works. You see the number 2 here, and you see the color red. So obviously we refer to the minor number 2 of the suit of fire, or the suit of wands, as you can remember it. And so this is the Two of Fire, the Two of Wands, and the keyword at the bottom refers to the number of possibilities that you actually contemplate whenever you are looking at your world. If you remember the symbology of the traditional RWS, there is this person that holds their entire world in their hand, and it's a smaller world, and so they contemplate the possibilities that will come their way if they decide to expand their horizon. One day I just decided not to use this deck by always referring back to the original meaning of the cards, but I wanted to use this deck as it was intended to be. And so I started using my intuition, going deep in the meaning of the images of the cards and letting myself be transported by where my imagination and my intuition were taking me. And I have to say, that's when I started really appreciating this deck. It is very emotional for me. Many of these cards are very potent, very strong. And also, in many, many cases, we're also looking at a different, slightly different, let's say, take on a few cards. And I'm talking about, for example, the Three of Swords, which is called Isolation. And as always, because of Murphy's Law, whenever you're looking for one card in specific, you never find it. Okay, so we can see the card here. So we're talking about the Three of Swords, and we know that it's the right card because you can see that the color is the gray, and gray refers back to the suit of air or the suit of swords, and it's the number 3. Now, the keyword in here says isolation, to be read as isolation. And I absolutely love what's been done to the meaning of this card. How much more we're actually entering the meaning of the card and the inspiration behind it. There is so much compassion, so much pathos in this card when you look at the way in which it has been depicted. I have to say that this was probably one of the cards that I related to the most because I personally don't always appreciate the traditional symbology of the Three of Cards as, let's say, depicted by Pixie by Pamela Coleman Smith. So if you remember, it's just a heart which is pierced by 3 swords. And even though that is very direct, very immediate, and very visual as a card, this one is just as visual, I believe, but it does give you an additional layer of interpretation. And in my case, since I read the number 3, numerologically speaking, in the suit of the mind, it does show me the sense of having lost control over the overwhelming force of our thoughts. So this was probably one of the cards that convinced me to read this deck by following my intuition. Although I have to say, I really, really like going back and forth between the cards and the guidebook because some of the descriptions are so very compassionate. I mean, look at this card, the mind, for example, or control. And these are referring back to the core cards of the suit of the mind, the suit of swords. Also, the major arcanas that you go have been renamed. So, for example, in this case, we're looking at number 14 in the major arcanas, which is traditionally called Temperance. But in this case, it has been renamed as Integration. And I really do appreciate this particular way of looking at the Temperance card. Is it the only keyword I would use for the Temperance card? No, because the Temperance card for me is also about time. But it is a really beautiful way to refer to it. And I have to say, most of these cards really show me how deep I can go in a reading. And so when I started using this deck and I felt confident enough in my reading practice to use this deck, it was mostly to read something about feelings in a situation, how we feel in regards to a situation we are going through, that we are facing. And in many, many cases, I was very appreciative because when I was doing personal reading for myself, this has been one of those decks that really helped me through some really tough times. And so this is one of the decks that I considered a staple in my collection. It is also a deck that made me a better reader and in many, many ways made me a more compassionate reader. I don't know if I would recommend this deck for a beginner, but then again, I mean, if this resonates for you, I mean, I'm not gatekeeping. I don't think there is a manual one-on-one of what you should and should not do in your practice. So if the images or the renaming of the cards resonate with you, by all means, go for it, because it's very, very important to feel at ease when we are reading tarot. Now, this one was a number 1, as I said, with 65,300 posts on Instagram. All of them spelled as hashtag Osiris Zen Tarot. So there was no possibility for this deck to be, misunderstood for a different deck. This is indeed the one that all of these posts refer back to. But I have to say that among all of these decks that we've been looking at today, there is a special mention. Let me just grab for it. And the reason why it's a special mention, because it's one of those decks that unfortunately is not just the name of the deck itself, but it's also referring to a different system of divination, and you probably guessed it. So we're talking about the Thoth Tarot. This is the very own Aleister Crowley and Lady Frida Harris deck. And it's a very old one, although it was just shy of being a Greeny, unfortunately. unfortunately. This one, well, the copyright is from 1978. However, I believe that this deck is from the 80s. And it was really funny because let me tell you, I know that nowadays greenies, as we call the decks with the default in the production, so if you've never seen a greenie, unfortunately, you're not going to see it in my channel because I don't have one, but I'm going to explain what I'm referring to. So a greenie was one of these decks that had a kind of a flaw in production, and all of these borders, instead of being this kind of a grayish color, they came out with a greenish kind of color. Back then, it was really considered a flaw, like a fault in the production. And so people actually did not want that. It was so funny because nowadays a greenie fetches something like around 300 Australian dollars and even more than that, depending on the condition and the year in which it has been printed. So it was I find it very ironic that, something that was considered something wrong is now coveted by the tarot collectors community. Even though this deck has been hashtagged 63,700 times on Instagram so far, I couldn't really bring myself to put it in the top 10. And the reason behind that, if you go and have a quick look at those 63,000 posts, you will see that this tag, so hashtag Thoth Tarot, has been used in many, many cases, not referring to this deck in specific, but referring to the Thoth in general. And so I felt like I'm sorry, but it was just way too difficult to try and understand which ones of those 63,000 posts were actually referring to this deck and not any other Thoth or Thoth-inspired deck. But one thing is certain, this deck is extremely popular, and so I felt like I still really had to mention this deck, which, by the way, is really, really beautiful. Some of these cards, in particular the Death card, which I've probably already shown you, is one of my favorite Death card of all time. Now, this was it for today. So we had a look at the top 10 most popular decks on Instagram of all times, and I hope that it was fun. I certainly had fun doing this kind of research because I really like to understand how the tarot community works around the world, and Instagram seemed to be probably at this point, maybe 5 years from now, it will not be that social platform, but for now, it seems to be the most reliable platform to show how many posts there are in relation to specific decks. Now, it was a kind of a difficult and targeted research, so if you think that I missed out on a few decks that are more popular, let's say, than the ones that we've seen today, please let me know in the comments below, because as I said, I needed to search with the specific name of that deck, and so obviously I may have missed out on one or two, and I'll be more than happy to have a look if you just mention them in the comments below. But for now, have a great day.